This series is called The Road to Faith. When life gets out of control and fear strikes. The most dangerous moment in your life is not when the storm comes. It is when you begin to believe something false about God in the middle of the storm. We all face storms, financial storms, medical storms, relational storms, inner storms. And the question inevitably comes, if God is with me, why is there a storm? This passage looks at not how to escape storms. It is about who Jesus is in the storm. The call of Jesus. In verse 35, Jesus says, "Let us cross over to the other side." The Greek verb dielthomen means to pass through or to cross over. It presents the action as a complete whole. The emphasis is not on the process. It is on how they will cross. The emphasis is on the crossing as a certain reality. This supports the following truth. The outcome has already been established by His word. The initiative does not come from the disciples. It comes from Jesus. This journey is not an accident. It is His clear will, and that changes everything. When Jesus begins a journey in your life, He does not do it randomly. He acts with a purpose and with a certainty that you will reach the destination, even when the road is difficult. But the text corrects a false expectation. Being in the will of God does not mean that you will have an easy journey. The disciples obeyed Jesus and entered the boat. Then they sailed directly into a storm. They did not enter the storm because they made a mistake. They entered the storm because they obeyed. Here is the real tension for you. You can be exactly where God wants you to be and still experience fear, confusion, and pressure. That does not mean God has abandoned you. It means He is beginning to teach you who He truly is. When God begins to work in your life, do not stop when things become difficult. Do not run away. Stay on the road. The one who called you is also the one who will carry you to the end. The same thing happens today. A person draws near to God. He begins to read his Bible. He prays. He comes to church. And that is exactly when the storm begins. What are his storms? What can happen in a time like that? Well, he can experience pressure from the family. They say, "Why are you going there?" Or, "That's not our faith. You've changed too much." Maybe a cultural pressure. Maybe they come from an orthodox background and they begin to be seen as a traitor. Not because they've rejected God, but because they've begun to seek God personally. Possibly inner confusion. Who is right? What if I'm wrong? What if I lose my family because of this? Is this the right path for me? Which can lead to isolation. Friends begin to withdraw. Conversations become tense. He feels that he's no longer belonging anywhere. Possibly the struggle of sin. For the first time, they clearly see what is wrong in their life, and that hurts. Possibly fear occurs. What can I lose if I follow this way? What is the cost? What if God truly asks for everything? These are examples of storms that come. It does not come because the person has stepped outside the will of God. It's because they have entered it. Here is a real test. Not whether you begin, but whether you remain. When God begins to work in your life, do not stop when the pressure comes. Do not interpret the storm as evidence that you've chosen the wrong direction. The opposite, in fact, may be true. The storm may confirm that you have started a journey with Jesus worthwhile. In our passage, the storm comes in verses 37 and 38. A violent windstorm arose. The waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was filled nearly with water. This was not a small storm. Mark describes it as a violent windstorm. The Sea of Galilee is known for storms like this. Winds can descend rapidly from the surrounding mountains. Storms can arise without warning. The disciples were experienced fishermen. They knew of this. If they were afraid, the situation was serious. They knew the sea. They knew they had lost control, and water was entering the boat. And Jesus was sleeping. Where is God when I'm struggling? Why does he seem absent? The water keeps entering the boat. In the summer of 1967, a 17-year-old woman named Joni Eareckson Tada went swimming with some friends. She made an ordinary dive into the water. Nothing spectacular, nothing that appeared dangerous. But in that moment, everything changed. She struck the bottom. She fractured her spine. Within seconds, her life was divided into two parts, before and after. She was paralyzed from the neck down, without warning, without time to prepare, without control. That is a storm. It does not come when you are prepared. It does not warn you. It does not ask whether you are ready. That is exactly what happens in Mark 4. The disciples are in the boat. Everything appears normal. And then suddenly, a violent storm arises. What happens with wrong interpretation? In verse 38, the disciples wake Jesus and say, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Here, fear is exposed. It is not only the fear of death, it is the fear that God is not paying attention. It is the fear that he will leave you alone in your struggle and allow you to perish without intervening. Zondervan emphasizes this truth. Faith is not formed in control, but in certainty. The disciples wake Jesus and say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Here is the real problem. It is not the storm. It is their interpretation of the storm. Now notice carefully. They do not merely say, "We are afraid." There is something much more serious. It is, "You do not care." The storm outside the boat produces a conclusion about Jesus' character, that he does not care. This is exactly where the people of God failed in Exodus 14 through 16. When the crisis came, they did not merely say, "This is difficult." They said, "Did you bring us here to die? We were better off in Egypt." Fear never remains only an emotion. Fear becomes an interpretation. Fear begins to rewrite the character of God in our minds. The disciples see the storm. The disciples feel fear, but their conclusion is, "You do not care." We must be very careful here. This is no longer merely panic. This is theology in crisis. This is what you believe about God when you lose control. The same struggle exists in you. You may not say, "Lord, you do not care," but we may say it in other ways. When the problem continues, you ask, "Why do you not intervene? Why are you silent? Why do you work in the lives of others but not mine? Why are you leaving me here?" The same question is hidden beneath all of these other questions. Lord, do you truly care? Joni went through this exact struggle. After the accident, she said, "I desperately wanted to kill myself." That shows how deep the storm can become. But years later, that same woman, the same injury, said, "I'd rather be in a wheelchair, knowing Jesus as I do, than be in my feet without him." What changed? Not merely her circumstances, her interpretation changed. At first, the storm told her story about God. Later, Christ showed her who he was in the storm. That is the difference between panic and mature faith. Mature faith does not mean a life without storms. It means deeper knowledge of Christ in the storm. You can ask yourself directly, what does fear say about God? The fear that God does not see is something like this. If he saw what was happening, he would intervene. You feel invisible to him. The fear that God does not care says something like, perhaps he cares about others, but not about me. You compare yourself with others and reach a false conclusion. Fear that God is waiting too long may look like, why is he not doing something now? You confuse delay with indifference in that thought process. Fear that God has lost control may look like something entirely different. You may not say it directly, but you may live your life as if you have slipped out of his hands. Fear that God is punishing you may look something like, I have done something wrong, and this is the payment. Everything becomes guilt instead of relationship. The fear that God will leave you alone. Now this is the deepest fear. In the end, I am on my own. And then there's the fear that God is not good to you. You do not deny his existence, but you question his character. Your fear is neutral. It preaches, it interrupts, it builds conclusions. The question is this: are your conclusions about God in this crisis true? This is what is at stake. The storm does not create unbelief. The storm brings to the surface what you already believe about God. It reveals what you believe about God when you lose control. The same struggle exists in you. What are your real fears concerning God in the storms of life? That is the real problem. Not the storm, but the interpretation of the storm. It happened in Exodus. It happened in the boat. The storm does not create unbelief. It exposes it. Apply this directly. When you are afraid, do not stop at the emotion, but ask yourself, what am I saying about God right now? Your fear is not neutral. It tells a story about God. And the question is that story true? Now we see the revelation of Jesus. In verses 39 through 41, Jesus gets up. He does not pray. He commands. Be silent, be still. And nature obeys him. Mark uses the same verb that he uses when Jesus commands demons. The forces of chaos submit to him. In the Old Testament, only Yahweh rules over the sea. The conclusion is clear. Jesus does what only God can do. Then he asks, why are you so afraid? The word is not describing ordinary fear. It describes a fear marked by lack of trust. The problem is not the storm. It was not the storm. The problem was that the disciples did not know him well enough. Their final reaction is, who is this? Their fear of the storm becomes holy awe. They begin to understand. They were not merely with a teacher. They are with the Lord who rules over chaos. The central idea is that the presence of Jesus does not mean an absence of a storm. It means the presence of his authority in the middle of it. The storm does not mean abandonment. The question is not, why is there a storm? The question is, who is in the boat? Faith does not eliminate fear. Faith redirects it. A crisis exposes your real theology. You do not truly believe only what you say. You reveal what you believe through what you do when the storm comes. When life gets out of control, what do? Do you pray or do you accuse? The road to faith often begins in a storm. The question is not whether the storm is coming. The question is whether you can recognize the one who says, be still.